The room was absolute black. Daniel sat perfectly still, his breath hitching in the stagnant air. Then, the screen ignited. A harsh, artificial blue light cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He stared down at the display. The name, Mom, pulsed rhythmically, a steady, glowing beacon in the void. He did not move. He did not blink. His mother had been buried for years, the earth long since settled over her resting place. The phone vibrated against the wooden surface. Daniel reached out, his fingers hovering inches above the glass. The light reflected in his pupils, wide and unmoving. He counted the pulses. 1, 2, 3. Each flicker felt like a strike against his chest. He knew the number was disconnected. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles straining against the skin, and stared at the glowing letters until they blurred. He finally reached out, his thumb trembling, and hovered over the green icon. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in. He pressed the icon. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then, the line opened. A harsh, metallic static hissed into his ear, sharp enough to make him wince. Beneath the noise, a sound emerged, a slow, rhythmic grinding. It was her voice, thin and distorted, stretched out of shape by some impossible distance. "Don't come here," the voice rasped. The words were barely audible, vibrating with a jagged, unnatural frequency. Daniel gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, where are you?" He leaned forward, straining to hear past the static. The grinding sound returned, louder this time, drowning out the ambient noise of the house. "Don't come here," she repeated. The warning was cold, devoid of any warmth or recognition. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the blank screen, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, the warning echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. The screen remained black, a dead mirror reflecting his own pale, wide-eyed face. Daniel tapped the glass, his thumb shaking. Nothing. He pressed the power button, and the device shuddered to life, bypassing the lock screen entirely. A map interface bloomed in the dim light. A single blue dot pulsed with a rhythmic, hypnotic frequency. It was not his home. It was not the city. The icon hovered over the coordinates of the town cemetery. Daniel stared, his breath hitching in his throat. The distance was marked in stark, glowing numbers. He dropped the phone onto the table, but it slid, landing face up. The dot continued to pulse, a steady heartbeat of light. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. His hands were no longer just trembling. They were twitching. He moved to the hallway, his movements jerky. He reached for his keys, fumbling until they clattered to the floor. He slammed the door, the sound swallowed instantly by the suffocating night. The engine roared to life, a jagged intrusion in the absolute stillness of the street. He pulled away, tires crunching over loose gravel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The town was a ghost of itself, houses dark and unblinking, windows like hollow sockets watching him pass. Every mile felt like a descent into deeper shadow. The silence outside was thick, pressing against the windshield as if the very air were trying to hold him back. He drove past the familiar landmarks, now unrecognizable in the gloom, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The cemetery gates appeared in his headlights, two rusted iron sentinels rising from the earth. He braked hard, the vehicle skidding to a halt. He stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. He reached for the iron, his palms slick with sweat. He pushed, the hinges shrieked, a long, agonizing sound. The gate swung inward. He walked into the dark, the weight of the silence settling over his shoulders. Daniel moved through the rows of stone, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The phone remained pressed against his ear, the static now a rhythmic, pulsing hum that vibrated against his jaw. He followed the GPS indicator, his eyes darting between the glowing screen and the markers. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air growing colder with each yard he gained toward the center of the grounds. He stopped. Before him stood the familiar headstone, its surface clean, the grass around it perfectly level and undisturbed. There were no signs of recent movement, no upturned soil, no decay. The voice on the phone suddenly sharpened, cutting through the ambient hiss with terrifying clarity. "Don't come here," it rasped, the tone urgent and devoid of its previous distortion. Daniel stood frozen, his gaze locked on the engraved name. The phone pulsed in his hand, a frantic heartbeat of light. Then, the voice shifted again, becoming cold and lucid. "You are not beside me," she said. "That is why you are still alive." The implication hung in the air, sharper than the biting wind. He stared at the motionless stone. Daniel stood motionless, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence of the cemetery was absolute, a heavy weight that seemed to press the very air out of his lungs. He looked down at the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, but the display flickered, the GPS dot dying into a gray void. He was alone, or he had been. Behind him, the sharp, dry crack of a twig snapping echoed through the rows of stone. It was a small sound, yet in the stillness, it struck like a gunshot. He did not turn. His muscles locked, every nerve ending screaming for him to run. But his feet remained rooted to the damp grass. A sudden, biting breeze swept past him, cold enough to sting, brushing against the nape of his neck like a phantom hand. He shivered, the cold sinking deep into his bones. Then, the air itself seemed to vibrate. "Why did you answer the phone?" The voice did not come from the device in his hand. It was hollow, gravelly, and deep, as if the soil beneath his boots were speaking. It was an echoing sound, devoid of warmth, vibrating through the ground and up into his legs. Daniel felt the hair on his arms stand up. He gripped the phone, his knuckles white, and slowly began to rotate, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Daniel turned with agonizing slowness, his boots scraping against the gravel path. His gaze swept past the rows of weathered markers, finally settling on the space 10 feet away. A figure stood there, motionless, anchored to the shadows between two towering oaks. It was her, the same jawline, the same set of the brow, the same familiar posture he had known his entire life. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, a desperate, irrational hope surging in his chest, but the sound died in his throat. He looked closer. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, but it was the eyes that shattered his reality. Where there should have been irises and pupils, there were only deep, hollow pits of absolute darkness. They did not reflect the moonlight. Daniel felt his stomach drop, a cold realization washing over him. This was not his mother. It was a void wearing a memory. The entity shifted. It did not walk. It twitched forward, limbs moving with the sharp, disjointed rhythm of a broken clock. Each step was a violent jerk, a stutter in reality that brought it inches closer. Daniel stared, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the motion. He looked down, desperate for the blue glow of the GPS, but the screen flickered once, a frantic pulse of light, and then went black. The darkness rushed in to fill the void, absolute and suffocating. He was blind, trapped in the center of the cemetery with only the sound of his own ragged breathing to guide him. The air grew heavy, pressing against his skin like deep water. He fumbled with the phone, pressing the power button, shaking it, but it remained a dead weight in his palm. Then, the silence broke. A soft, wet sound of movement cut through the dark, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of something hard against stone. The entity was no longer standing still. It was closing the distance. Daniel braced himself, his muscles coiling, but before he could retreat, the air in front of him displaced. A sudden, cold pressure surged forward. The figure lunged, a blur of motion in the pitch black, and the last thing Daniel heard was the sharp, final sound of his own gasp cut short. Daniel scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the damp, uneven grass. He did not look back. He ran by instinct, his hands outstretched to find the path he had walked earlier. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against his eyes. He stumbled, his shoulder slamming into a cold granite marker, but he pushed off it, lungs burning, heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the scrape of movement behind him, a rhythmic, dragging sound that kept pace with his frantic retreat. He reached for the perimeter, his fingers grazing the rough, rusted metal of the cemetery fence. He followed the iron bars, his breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. Then, his hand found the gap. The gate. He lunged forward, throwing his weight against the iron frame to force his way out. He was halfway through the opening when the metal groaned. It was not a natural sound. It was the screech of heavy, long dormant hinges protesting. Before he could clear the threshold, the gate swung back with impossible speed. It hit the stone pillar with a deafening final clang. The vibration traveled through the metal, up his arms, and into his chest. He grabbed the bars, pulling, shaking, but the lock had engaged. A heavy iron bolt slid into place with a sharp, metallic click that echoed across the rows of silent graves. He was inside. The dragging sound behind him stopped. In the suffocating stillness, he realized the gate was not meant to keep the world out, but to keep him in. The silence returned, and then there was only the sound of the wind.